Kia ora, hello, and miri kirihimete, which means Merry Christmas here in New Zealand, the land down under. Wherever you are in the world, I want to wish you a fabulous Merry Christmas. I hope that you're enjoying the festive season if you celebrate it. And I want to say thank you for your support throughout this very unusual year. I'll be back again in about 5 weeks' time in February of 2022. Don't forget you can get hold of me, Kirsty, at letstalkneardeath.com. But before then, let's get into this episode.
I never even thought about the notion of an afterlife. I thought that was like a subject for cartoons. He said that these early Greek philosophers knew of cases where people had apparently died but been revived and told these stories and experiences. So that was in my mind as of September of 1962. She said, when you die, you just go up and you be with God, and He keeps you up there till all the people you know while you're alive have died, and then He sends you back as another person.
Hello, kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome back to another episode of the Let's Talk Near Death podcast. Today, I have to say I'm extremely excited. I'm excited to be chatting with someone whose work has had a massive impact on the way that I've spent my time, on the research that I've been doing, and the founding part of getting this podcast up and running. Today, I'm chatting with Dr. Raymond Moody. Dr. Raymond Moody coined the term near-death experience in 1975, just alongside when he wrote his book, Life After Life, which has changed everything in this world of near-death experiences. I highly recommend getting your hands on this book if you haven't already. For half a century now, he has researched some of life's greatest mysteries. As both a PhD in philosophy and an MD, he has a strong interest in how medical realities intersect with the ineffable realm of philosophy. Throughout his 5-decade career, he has explored themes relating to transpersonal aspects of death, dying, and grief. In his book, Glimpses of Eternity, he discusses the phenomena of shared death experiences. He writes about inquiry into past lives in his book, Coming Back, and shares messages for evoking the dead from ancient Greece to modern times in his book, Reunions. He is also the author of his latest book, God is Bigger Than the Bible, and he is one of the leading authorities on life, death, and experiences in between. Dr. Raymond Moody, welcome to the Let's Talk Near Death podcast. I am honoured to be chatting with you today. Thank you so much for your time. Tell us, how did your research begin? How did you come to write this amazing book, Life After Life? And where do we set the scene for the work that you've been doing ever since?
Well, really, basically, it relates to something I've been fascinated with since I was 7 years old, and was part of my doctoral dissertation in philosophy in 1969. And it's just something I've continued to work on because my first life interest was astronomy. And at the same time, I was a big fan at 7 or 8 of Lewis Carroll and Dr. Seuss and Edward Lear. And I always just loved nonsense. It was such a great mental challenge. And I realized looking through a telescope when I was about 7 or 8 that the world we're in is nonsense, right? Because you automatically ask yourself the question, how big is this thing we're in? But then your mind goes out to the wall, right? But you think, just a minute, doesn't there have to be something on the other side of the wall? But the other option seems to be that it goes on forever and ever, and that doesn't make sense either. So about the age of 7, I was fascinated, and still am, with the question of why certain things don't make sense. It's a very important factor in literature and science and advertising, and it's just something I've been interested in since I was a kid. Now, at this time, I was not yeah, I can't say I was an atheist. It was just that the idea of God didn't play into my worldview. My dad was a professional military officer and also surgeon in World War II. And I gather, retrospectively, that he probably saw such terrible things that it just soured him on religion. So that's how I grew up. It was just kind of religion was a topic for sarcasm or jokes. And I never even thought about the notion of an afterlife. I thought that was like a subject for cartoons. So then I went away to the University of Virginia at age 18 and determined to study astronomy, but I took a philosophy course because I was interested in philosophy. And just within the first couple of days of that philosophy course, I said, I'm hooked. I'll be a philosophy major. And what caught my attention was Plato's Republic, which was the first book we had to read in that class. And I thought it was just mind-boggling. And I thought that first Plato became my hero instantly after the first few pages. And then the whole book is about this, what we now call a near-death experience. It's about, everybody says it's about justice, and which it is, but it's about justice in relationship to the question of an afterlife. And it all culminates in this, just very dramatic scene where this warrior is bleeds dead on the battlefield, but he revives and he tells the people standing around about how he got out of his body and he went through a passageway into another world and he saw all these things. He saw his life reviewed and stuff. And but the fact that Plato took that seriously made an impact on me because I never heard of such a thing. Mm-hmm. So I asked my professor, Professor Hammond, what is this all about? And he said that these early Greek philosophers knew of cases where people had apparently died but been revived and told these stories and experiences. So that was in my mind as of September of 1990. September of 1962. And I've never recovered. I was really, and Professor Hammond was also saying that a little before Plato, there was another Greek philosopher named Democritus, and that Democritus had just figured out by reasoning out, it's a complicated argument, but it makes sense that he just figured out that contrary to our experience that this tabletop in front of me is solid, that in reality, it has to be made up of tiny little bits that are too small to be seen, atoms. And so in his writings about this, Democritus said that these cases just represent the residual biological activity in the body. He said there's no such thing as a moment of death, so they look dead, but it's a process. And he said the experiences result from the biological residual things. So isn't it interesting we're having that same debate today? So that's how I got interested in this. I went on, majored in philosophy, and got my PhD in philosophy. But in the meantime, in 1965, 3 years after I read this Republic, I met Dr. George Ritchie, who was the first living person that I heard this from. And subsequent to that time, I've talked to literally thousands of people from all over the world and who've had these experiences. So that is my kind of life history in connection with that. And in terms of what the nonsense has to do with it, well, people use that notion of life after death in ordinary language in everyday life, but we use it kind of casually. And of course, it may bring some very vivid images and feelings to our mind. But if you try to analyze it for cognitive content, it doesn't make any sense because technically it's a self-contradiction, right? To say that if you look up the words, to say that life after death, that there's life after death is to say that there is life after the final irreversible cessation of life, which is a self-contradiction, right? And many of the great philosophers have pointed out the conceptual dilemma of this. And that is what drew me to it, because if you think about it, and first of all, my whole life attitude is that nonsense is something wonderful. I think it's not so bad in England. I don't know about Australia. I know in England, as people are much looser about it. But, the Americans, they love nonsense, like Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald scat singing and doo-wop music from the 50s with the combination of the nonsense and the mean shining on, which is the same structure, by the way, as shaman songs. And and also you think of the nursery rhymes, the playground rhymes, the books of Dr. Seuss have sold over 600 million copies. And Lewis Carroll, I'm sure, that just sells forever. So people love nonsense.
They absolutely do.
They love it, but they don't like the word nonsense in America. And that's why, it's like the Americans were just like Puritans, right? They came over here and like to impose their severe religion on everybody else, and still trying to do it. That kind of mentality was the Protestant work ethic, right? Like that and Americans just, they were kind of struggling for all this living on the frontier. Well, they got too practical for this, right? It's like, to Americans, it's a hard sell to think of nonsense as something positive. In Britain, I've had, it's an easy sell.
Isn't it interesting? I think we crave nonsense. I feel like there's an element of nonsense that brings a relief. It's like a chance to pause and breathe, and it just refreshes really difficult situations. And where we are right now in a really difficult environment right across the globe, I feel like a little bit of nonsense just comes in. It's like a little child comes in and they refresh the room with their silliness, and there's something really beautiful about it. Yeah.
There is, and it's been, just throughout history, it's been one of the great spiritual modalities. Everybody in the West kind of knows about glossolalia, or speaking in unknown tongues, which is a Christian thing where they utter nonsense syllables. Linguists have analyzed glossolalia, and they find that it consists of nonsense syllables drawn from the speaker's own language, put together in ways that avoid meaningful combinations or any grammatical structures. And so the reason they do it is, I found out myself, you don't have to be in a religious ceremony to experience this. I just found out about it, and one evening in my house, I just let go, and I just blah, 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 blah. And I didn't need to be in an ecstatic state to start it. I was just sitting around my house. But after, I guess, a few minutes, it was astonishing. It was like this realm you're in kind of peels off, and you are in another ecstatic state of consciousness. And I can easily imagine in that state of consciousness, you might be more accessible to God, right? Because I guess people say about the surrender. And then the koans, the same thing, like the nonsense questions, like what's the sound of one hand clapping? And the point of it was that when somebody asks you a question, even if it's nonsense, you feel pressured to answer, right? But just because of the grammatical form. And those mentalists have learned that. They call it double talk. If you put something in the interrogative mood and ask, did the merchant with the survey on the Ruggusum last way, that people will pay more attention to that than they will to ordinary meaningful language. And it's really fascinating to watch that. And so what relationship does it have to the afterlife? Well, you and I are interested in with the near-death experiences. Well, I always used to tell my students at East Carolina University, when I first introduced this topic, I told a story about Abraham Lincoln. And when he was president, there was a very formal state ceremony going on. I forgot what the occasion was, but it was something very solemn, very serious. And everybody was gathered in a big crowd around Mr. Lincoln, and his part in the in the ceremony called for him to mount a horse and to ride the horse away from the scene, right? And so when Lincoln tried to get up on the horse put its own back hoof up and got it caught in the stirrup. So the horse was dancing around. Everybody was shocked into silence, like, poor Mr. Lincoln. Oh my goodness, how embarrassing for the president. But Lincoln just looked down at the horse very calmly and he said, well, if you're getting on, I'm getting off. And the whole crowd was uproarious laughter, and the tension was broken, right? Well, if you think of it, it's nonsense to say that a horse could get on its back by putting a hoof in a stirrup and climbing aboard, but you got to admit it creates a very vivid image in your mind, right, of that movement. Now, what in the world does that have to do with near-death experiences? Well, what it shows is that you can put something in nonsense in the format of a travel story, and it creates a sort of sense of motion, even when there can't be such a motion literally. And so what do people with near-death experiences say? Number one, everybody says there are no words, right? It's beyond us to describe. And secondly, they say there was no time. Time stood still. I saw everything I'd ever done at once. And then there's no space. They say you're not in a spatial relationship anymore. It's like Evan Alexander one time, he and I were talking about this, and I said, well, you know, you can't orient yourself to time and space. I said, what is the orienting factors? And he said it's love and information, or love and knowledge is what, instead of space time, you see. So now, given that knowledge, see, it's that people say there's no time and there's no space and there's no words for it. But what happened was I got out of my body. I went through a tunnel into a light. I saw my deceased relatives. I saw my life pass in review. I returned to my body and came back to life. That's a travel narrative. But if you think about it, a travel narrative, the way you know the meaning of a travel narrative is because of this concepts of space and time, right? So what that means is that these experiences, these stories that are very significant and moving to us all, technically are nonsensical. But that's all right. That is exactly what we expect of something on the frontiers of knowledge. And so now, what in the world is this? You know, what's the practical implication? I guess I get asked. Well, I have learned over a period of decades now, figured out a way to get people to think logically about things that don't make sense, knowing full well that eventually somebody who had been through my preparation program would happen to have a near-death experience. And when they did, I knew that, I won't go into why, but it follows very clearly from psychological considerations, that in that circumstance, somebody going into a near-death experience, knowing in addition to the Aristotelian literal logical principles, which make it a travel narrative, but this perspective with these new principles, you would see that that can't be meaningful. So you would shift your formulation of it. And that means that we already have thousands of cases of near-death experiences viewed through the Aristotelian literal logic lens, which makes it a travel narrative. But now we see there's something wrong with that. But now we can fix that by putting together these new principles in our minds so that when we have a near-death experience, we will be able to formulate it in a new way. By the way, it's already happened at least once. A very eminent scientist and sculptor who had been to one of my workshops years before subsequently had a near-death experience. And to make a long story short, he said, and Raymond, while I was over there, my mind went back to the nonsense seminar. And he said, I realized that what you're saying is true, that you can't comprehend how that world is connected to this world unless you take the unintelligibility axis into account. Now, why is this important? All right, we have already these experiences viewed through the lens of Aristotelian literal logic. In the not too distant future, I think we'll have some additional experiences that are viewed in addition to the Aristotelian logic, also through these extra principles that enable you to think logically about things that are nonsensical, right? And so what that means is that we can compare these two kinds of accounts, right? And what there will be a difference, and it won't go into that, but you can see just by reasoning it through that there would be a difference. But now that we have this, let's think about how in the world do we know that it's 4.3 light years to Alpha Centauri? Have you ever thought about that one? I mean, it's like there's putting an odometer on a homing pigeon's wing, or a foot isn't a good option. So how did I figure? Well, it has to do with the fact that by the late 19th century or mid 19th century, they were able to measure what's called parallax, which means that if you think of the Earth here in its orbit, and 6 months later, it's 186,000 miles away from that point, because that's the distance across the orbit of the Earth, then you can, when it's here, you can measure the angles to the nearby stars very carefully. Wait exactly 6 months, you could see there'd be a tiny difference, right? Just a tiny, like in your high school trigonometry. And that's how they calculate the distance out to Alpha Centauri. As an obsessive man, I've also got to admit that only works out to 30 parsecs, which means 30 something light years. Beyond that doesn't work. But there are other methods beyond that. But now what I've got, is a similar method to use for life after death as our X. Now, we know how it's portrayed through this set of principles. Now we're going to know how it's portrayed through a supplementary set of principles. And that gives us parallax. We can hone in on the afterlife. Now, the difficulty with that is, this is largely a narrative-driven enterprise that you are in, right? You and I are in, right? That what people want to hear from us is stories, right? Which I do too. I mean, I've heard thousands of these stories. I can't wait to hear the next one. And at the same time, I have to acknowledge what Plato said that I read when I was 18 years old, which struck me. He said that there's got to be some kind of storyline with it. He said, because the notion of an afterlife is kind of obscure. So to get thought about it started, you got to have some sort of storyline. And they had the same stories we do. It's like you saw Uncle Alexei in the parlor after he died, or my Uncle Alexei, he fell over and he almost died, but when he came back, he told us. So it's, they had the same stories. And Plato loved the stories, but he also acknowledged, he said, even if we had a bazillion stories, that's not going to add up to rational proof of an afterlife. What we need in addition is some set of concepts to link the stories with the statement that it's an afterlife. And this is, I know it's not the kind of problem that will appeal to the average person who's lost a loved one, for example, and they're looking to consolation. But in the real world, we do now have a way of pinning this down, in the sense that all those kind of very confusing things about the afterlife, we can now think logically through it. And incidentally, I am, to my detriment, partly, I've never been interested in being a salesman or anything. I'm not trying to sell people a book, I swear to God. But in case you're interested in this subject, this is my book from about a year ago, Making Sense of Nonsense. And it's published by Llewellyn Publishers in the United States. But this has, it came from a course I taught at many universities over a long period of time on teaching students in my logic classes how to think logically about things that don't make sense. And I used exercises. They have to write different types of nonsense and then their own original examples after seeing the patterns, and then talk about, well, how did that make me feel? But it's the students over the years have been very, very, I still get communications from students I had 30 years ago, about how this, and it's just basically, it sounds so counterintuitive, but the fact is that the reason why we're stuck on the afterlife problem is that we can't think logically about things that don't make sense. But now we can. And, there's a new future coming on this whole afterlife project.
Definitely. There has to be. And there's so much coming out at the moment, isn't there? I find it fascinating. You've really got me thinking as you're talking around this nonsense concept, because like we were saying earlier, it's so refreshing. It's just to readjust, reset thinking and reset how things are going.
Yeah.
I can't help but wonder, as we're talking about nonsense, you said at one point, now I can't quote you completely, but it was something about having a sense of nonsense open us up to be more spiritually connected or more connected to the afterlife.
Yeah, it always has been. I mean, historically, it's just thick associations. For example, in the ancient Greek oracles of the dead, where people went, it was a subterranean environment, and after preparation and staying down there 29 days, they would go into a hallway, subterranean, lit by torchlight underneath. And there's a big bronze cauldron around there surrounded by a balustrade. And so after a 29-day preparation, people would go into the subterranean chamber. Well, they were in the subterranean world for 29 days, and then they go into this chamber where they actually would see the apparitions. And what this was that I knew of this effect as a psychiatrist, that if you take a highly polished object, like a silver bowl, for example, and you polish it very highly, you fill it with olive oil, and by a candlelight, you turn off the light, just dim illumination, and you gaze into that, many people will see these very vivid, lifelike visions. They're not like mental images which seem vague. You actually see them in your visual space, and they have their own life. You can't direct it, it just sort of unfolds. And so to stimulate this, the way they would do it before they would prepare as part of the preparation for the people who would be going through the procedure, would be to utter nonsense to them, and magic words, things that don't make any sense. And I tried that. I've done maybe, I don't know how many hundreds of the evocation procedures since I started studying this back in early 1990. And I've hundreds and hundreds. And, you can't spring this on everybody. A lot of the people are kind of uptight business people or something, or very structured. And so you've got to do a different thing with them. But people who are kind of like in tune and experimental and kind of knowledgeable, they're professors or whatever, I would incorporate the nonsense in the preparation procedure. And definitely in the cases I did, it makes it much more likely to succeed. And these recipes, they've thousands of years old. The recipe for calling up the dead using a mirror gazing arrangement, and the nonsense is, they're actual manuscripts from the ancient world that were preserved in the deserts of Egypt, where the climatic conditions were such. But it's part and parcel of human life, but it's just one that people, partly due to Aristotle, who was very literal minded and obsessional, and Plato had been trying to figure out, did a very good job of it, trying to figure out how nonsense works. Plato was the first to distinguish between the literal and the figurative domain of language. And when he did that, he linked the true-false distinction to the literal mode, which is why we say the literal truth, right? And he also, he sort of characterized the figurative domain as well. But he was also, in a separate book, he was working on how do you think about nonsense. And he found a lot of them that I discovered too. One is that nonsense makes people laugh, or that there is different types of nonsense, right? And that sounds so counterintuitive, but listen to this. 'Twas brilliant the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. That's nonsense. Type 1. Now listen to this. Holiness pursues the shining lipstick of vestigial eternity. Okay, that's nonsense too, but obviously a different type. Well, listen to this one. That cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this city. That's nonsense. And you can just tell, you can learn how to recognize the different types of nonsense. Each type has a different pattern. Each type has its own effect on the mind. And it just goes on and on. You know, hat thoroughly, the if, zoom, sounds, zest, or I mean, there's infinite amounts of different types, each of them, creating its own kind of mental effect.
I wonder if there's a really fine line between having an element of nonsense. And I love that you bring it back to laughter, because for me, I'm all about laughter. And I think we take this life way too seriously. And when things are going haywire and everything's crazy, I'll sit down and I'll literally just sit and mutter to myself, none of this matters. It's all okay. We're going to be okay. None of this matters. And it's a bit of a joke because my husband looks at me now and goes, are you telling yourself that none of this matters again? But I actually believe that. And I think we take this world and this life so seriously. So to bring in the nonsense, bring in the laughter, and just have that refresh makes a massive difference.
Absolutely. Plato said that same thing in the Laws. He said, if you really think it through, there's not anything serious about a life of the human beings. And he said, but we can't allow us to think that, that we get immersed in it, because it's an immersive experience, right? That when the brick drops on your toe, you feel the pain, right? So you're embedded in it. And Plato said, but, really, he said, we are God's toys, he said. And really the best way to deal with this life is just sort of play at it. And,
and have some fun.
Right.
Have some experiences.
It's a theater. It's a theater. It is. It's like, I think the reason people think that way about life being a sort of story or drama is not a metaphorical extension of the notion of a theater. I think what happened was that the theater came from the fact that when they're a certain age, as I was a geriatric psychiatrist to a very, very eloquent and accomplished community, where these were the local VIPs and, who didn't want to go up to the front door of the mental health clinic like the rest of us peons, right? So they had to be sneaked into the back. And I was it because I was older. I'd gone through a PhD in philosophy before I went to medical school and taught philosophy for a while, plus my book. So I was the one they wanted to do it. And it was fascinating because during that year, I heard some of the most eloquent people say that, Raymond, the older I get, the more when I look back at my life, I just have that, I can't kick the impression or the feeling that it's been a kind of story or script. And what I think this has to do with is that consciousness itself is a narrative. It has a narrative structure, right? What happens when you find when some significant new event happens to you, what do? Your mind automatically weaves it into your continuing life story. Cinematographers have studied something they call the Kulikov effect, I think it is. But it's like what they've learned is that if you take any two random images, right, just whatever, a pencil and a TV screen, that you present those two images in sequence, that the mind automatically starts weaving a story to connect them. So what that means, is our consciousness itself is story directed. And what is your personal identity other than your personal story, right? So the way I've put it together, this is a theater. It's we're here going through these stories, and then we die and we go through some incomprehensible process. And as I gather, we're back on another storyline. least that's what my two adopted kids have told me. And it's impressive because, Cheryl and I, my wife and I don't talk about life after death. We talk about the phone bill, what's for dinner, the school homework. This is my stuff I talk about in my profession. And we never took the kids to any sort of religious ceremonies or anything. And and I just didn't. They learned about a few years ago. They learned about my book, Life After Life, by looking me up on the internet.
Oh, seriously?
So, yeah.
Wow.
But both of them. I mean, it's still astonishing, but both of them told us stories of where they were beforehand, which we couldn't deny. It's like, for example, both of our kids were adopted at birth. Carter is Mexican American by heritage, and Carol Ann is a Native American Blackfeet Indian from Montana. But both cases, the obstetrician just delivered my son Carter and handed him to my wife Cheryl. Right? And same with Carol Ann, we had them from the very beginning, and we just not into religion stuff. But both of them, like Carter, when he was 5 years old, we were watching TV, and I was flipping through the channels. And when I flipped through what turned out to be, and when I went back to it, the National Geographic channel, but Carter became very, very animated. Said, Dad, that's my village.
Wow. Yeah.
And so I went back. It was a documentary about village life in China. And so he could tell that I was numb or shocked. And to explain, he said, yeah. Like before I was with you and Mommy, I was with my other family in China with my brothers and sisters and my other mommy and daddy. And I was just, what? And then as though to orient me, he said, yeah. And then I was up in the trees looking at you and Mommy lying in the grass. And I knew exactly what he meant, because some time before, Cheryl and I had been in Greece, and we went on the plane, and we were just exhausted this one day. But we were at this archaeological site, and the attendant could tell we were just exhausted. So he said, go over there and lie down in the grass and take a nap. And there were these big trees all around, and we were talking about adopting a baby.
Wow.
And then Carol Ann came to me in the spring of 81 or 82. And I had two grown sons at that time who were older then, and I loved my sons, and I'd always wanted a daughter, but my wife had fertility difficulties, so it wasn't advisable for her to have another pregnancy because of the danger. And so I was just sitting on this porch swing, very like a spring evening in Charlottesville, and I just entertained this. It was a daydream, or it wasn't like a prayer. I didn't set it up as prayer, but out of nowhere, this very deep, heartfelt feeling came over me that how wonderful it would be to adopt a Native American daughter. And then I just sort of let it go. I really kind of dwelled on it that night. That was 81 or 82. Now flash forward to 2000. And some years before that, I had been in New Mexico and was giving a lecture. And the previous speaker was at the podium and I was in the audience, right? And so he finished his lecture. And then he asked for questions. But this arrangement was such that to ask your question, you had to go line up in the central aisle with a microphone. Right. Now, that to me is not a big deal. Well, it is a little bit. To a Native American woman, that's not good. That violates the code of politeness. So anyway, she was sitting next to me. Her name turned out to be Christine, a Blackfeet lady. And you could tell by her body language. She wanted so much to ask her a question. So my wife kind of punched me, and I just naturally took Christine up by the arm and took her up and let her watch her and ask her a question, right? Well, that was 1996. Then we adopted Carter in 1998. And then about 2 years later, a little over 2 years, Christine just called up out of nowhere. How are you doing? I remember her voice, cheerful. How are you doing? I said, oh, we're doing great. We've adopted a baby. And she said, oh, I wish so much I had known you were looking. She said, because I work on the reservation, I work in the hospital, and I'm the very first person to find out when we have an adoptive situation. And so I said, well, by all means. A couple of months later, she called me, your daughter is on her way. So that's how I acquired my best friend and my dear daughter, Carol Ann. And when she was about 9 years old, we used to take these long walks. And she liked to sit on this wooden bridge about a mile from where we lived and talk. And this one day, she said, I don't like this place. And it was plain that she meant the world. I don't know how. I said, huh? She said, yeah. She said, when you die, you just go up and you be with God, and he keeps you up there till all the people you know while you're alive have died. And then he sends you back as another person. And I said, well, what makes you think that? And she said, I just know in my mind. And she said, and I was with God, and he pointed you out to me. And he said, you got to go down to be his daughter. And I said, well, how did you feel about it? She said, oh, I didn't want to do it. I wanted to stay with my God. But she said, but he pushed me just twice like this. But he pushed me down to be your daughter. And she relates going through the clouds. And, I don't know why. I am a skeptic in that sense that is the real sense of the word. And unfortunately, the people who characterize themselves as skeptics about near-death experiences or skeptics about apparitions and diseases, frankly, 77 years old, I'm confident enough to say this now. They don't know what they're talking about because the skeptical movement was formed by Pyrrho, who was about 20 years after the death of Aristotle, who codified logic. Pyrrho figured out, well, we know how to use logic, which you can think of as a machine for generating conclusions, but he said, what would happen if we go through all the process, but we don't draw the conclusion, that we refrain? And that was the point of it. And it was a mind-bending exercise, right? If you discipline yourself like that, which I do, it does amazing things to your mind. And also, if you think about it geometrically, and everybody else is rushing in this direction to get to the conclusion, but your technique is to turn away from a conclusion, then you see things on the periphery that everybody else has missed because they're running in this direction. And so when you know that knowledge, then you couldn't say, oh, I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. Because to unpack that, it says, well, I'm a person who doesn't draw conclusions, and my conclusion is such and such, which is a self-contradiction. It's people who have that mentality are very threatened by this for reasons I can't really figure out. I guess it varies in each case, but it doesn't make them very good colleagues to try to figure this out. See, it's like they think they already know, whereas I am in a constant state of ignorance on it. Yeah. But I can't draw a conclusion, but where I got to say that I feel like I've just painted myself into a corner. I just don't know what else to say except, I never thought it was the oxygen deprivation to the brain.
Yeah.
On philosophical reasons more than anything else, something had to do with a doctrine called epiphenomenalism, which is a philosophical doctrine is that the mind and the brain is the essential reality and the chemical reactions in it, whereas consciousness is a secondary, unreal byproduct. And so that's kind of behind this oxygen deprivation to the brain thing. But as one of my own medical school professors told me at my first year, because I'd already been doing this research, the faculty knew about it. And she approached me in the bookstore one day and she said, Dr. Moody, I've been waiting to talk to you about some mentation I had when I was trying to resuscitate my mother. And she had this same thing, trying unsuccessfully to resuscitate her mother. She said, as she felt her mother die, she herself lifted out of her body, could see the scene from below. So orienting herself, she became aware of her mother there, now in spirit form, was her terminology. And she said she saw her mother recede into this light and being greeted by spirits that she recognized, some of the people who had known her mother beforehand and so on. And then that went back into the tunnel as it was. And she said, then she came back to her own body. And I've heard hundreds of stories like that. Yeah, if it's oxygen deprivation to the brain, why would the bystanders who are not ill or injured have exactly the same experience? But people are afraid of this. I mean, it's humorous to me because I've spent my life sort of studying the reasoning process, and I enjoy it. But there are just some people who are so threatened by it, it's because they think they know what is, but they really don't. I mean, inwardly, they're just as insecure as you or I, but they've got to project this knowledge. Whereas I'm just very comfortable in saying, I don't know.
And I love that. I find it fascinating that after the years, the decades of research that you've done, all of the experiences that you've looked into, the personal experiences you've had yourself, even those ones with your children saying that they were up in the tree and I had to come back and be with you. All these experiences that you're still here saying, but I don't really know all that much. I find that beautiful. I love it.
Well, and also it's true if you think about it. I guess maybe if somebody goes through a life process where they study some concrete thing that has an answer, they might have, but my interest was astronomy. Yeah. And the first time I looked through a telescope, I knew number one, I love to learn things, but that in reality, I'll never know much of anything. And that was okay with me. I always thought that's just the way it is. You can't know much, but the things you can learn are really, really fascinating.
They so are, aren't they? There's so much to learn, so many conversation points. And that's what I love. And you bring in the nonsense and you throw that into the mix. And it's just one big, giant, beautiful playground for me. I love it. Going back to when you wrote your book, 1975, Life After Life, you were seen as a pioneer in your time. You're saying now that actually you didn't really know very much. What was actually going through your head? Were you quite afraid of that?
Of what? I'm sorry.
Were you afraid of putting that content out into the world?
No.
Was it nonsense?
I knew that. I mean, by that time, I talked to about 150 people that had this experience. And I started when I was a professor at East Carolina University in 1969 to 72. And I would talk about this in my philosophy classes. And so the word got from the students and then the civic clubs. I don't know if you have those, but Ben Franklin got these things started. They meet every Wednesday at 2 p.m. and have a bunch of, anyway, it's just an American institution. And they all have to have a speaker once a week, and so, this professor over here. And I quickly noticed that then at that time, it was essentially like an exclusively male province, right? It was just all the mover and shaker type men in town. And I was astonished, like every player I went, there's like the same thing. Come up to me. These were the banker president or the mayor, and Dr. Moody, I've never told anybody this, but, and so I knew this is something that anybody can confirm for themselves just by asking around their own family members. But what I thought would happen was that just a very few people would read that book. I wrote it in 1974. It was published in November of 1975. And I felt very confident what would happen would be that it would end up in the hands of a few medical doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists, or who would probably or may very well say, oh, this guy's nuts or something. But that of the ones who did actually think, and ask their patients, I knew that they would find the same thing. And that's what happened. So I was not afraid. I am a social phobic. I'm the kind of person who at a party, I want to find a dark corner and hope nobody comes to talk to me.
Yep.
And so that part of it, it was not something I relished, talking to the, to the press, but at the same time, I was a forensic psychiatrist. I talked to serial killers, mass murderers, paranoid schizophrenic killers. And so, journalists weren't very formidable to me. So, I wasn't really afraid of them, because I found you get to the point where you're not, I walked into a unit every day with probably at any one time 120 violent male psychotic patients who had done these gosh awful things like you read about in the tabloid. And people ask, were you afraid? Well, no, because it's just too fascinating to be afraid. The curiosity overwhelms your fear.
Yeah.
So no, I was not scared. I didn't like the traveling. I still don't like traveling, and I realized very quickly that the journalistic community is some very smart people in there, and there's also some people who just want to make a show or something. Like I said, after dealing with paranoid killers, it wasn't much to worry about.
Yeah, exactly. And did you have any kind of surprise when your work took off the way that it did? Were you expecting, what were you thinking would happen from putting your book out and your research?
I thought that, like I said, that it would end up in the hands of a few medical and psychological professionals, and some of them would be wondering, let me try to see, and then they would quickly find out that I was right. I knew, but I didn't think it would be a public thing. I thought it would be, my projection was that, it'll build gradually from a few people who research, and that has happened, but it happened at a much faster time and speed than I imagined. Yeah.
What was that like?
Well, I don't like travel. I'm a homebody. So that was the worst part of it. And also, when people treat you like you know something and you don't, it's time to discombobulate it, right? And they were all kind of assuming, a lot of them were kind of assuming, he's trying to prove life every now. No, I said it early in the book. It's like there's enormous difficulties in trying to prove an afterlife. But it was an interesting experience. And it got me to meet my wife, Cheryl. I was back in September of 1992. I had, I wasn't bitter about marriage, but I just figured, this is not good. I'm not cut out. I'd had a marriage that failed after 20 years. So but I wasn't contemplating marriage, but I was down in St. Petersburg, Florida, and got in. They asked me to come and do this interview on TV to promote the program I was doing in town, right? And so I was sitting there in the green room, and all of a sudden the door just flashed open, and this blonde mop bounced in with a big blue silk dress with a stain on it, a coffee stain. And she just, not even looking at me, I was the only person in the room that she threw her arms out as though she were declaiming to an audience of, 50,000.
Yeah.
Well, I've been divorced for 2 years. I don't know if anybody's going to be sexually interested in me anymore.
Oh,
And
really?
yeah, well, I immediately picked it up that she was just had a wacky sense of humor, and said, she had picked that up about me, that I was shy. So, but anyway, it just was after a year, we decided, well, why not marry your best friend? So we've been married now for almost 30 years. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's beautiful. Congratulations. That's
Well,
lovely. Yeah.
well, like I said, it did good things came out of it, but I'm not so hip on being a celebrity, to tell you the truth. It's
Mm,
but at the same time, I thank God for all the wonderful things that have happened.
mm,
I just and it's been a really fascinating thing to see that apparently, this, I take people at their word that this has made an impact in their lives, and that makes me
oh,
feel really
boy.
good.
I mean, me personally, it has made a massive impact. Your work, I can see it in the work that I'm doing. I see how your work has triggered and sparked off so many things and so many conversations. And I feel a lot when we share our stories. Today's been a bit of a different interview for me because I've just been engrossed in your stories. I'm thinking, forget my questions. I want to hear your stories. But when we come to terms with what happens in our lifetime and our personal story, you said at one point that's all we are, is our personal story.
Yeah. Mhm.
I think when we come to terms with that and we embrace who we are, what we're going through, what we're learning, what we're experiencing, then we
Mhm.
become almost like a more authentic version of ourselves, which
Yeah.
allows us to be more open, to be more connected, which it's all part of that great process. And I see that that's come from so many people who have been exposed to your early work. So definitely, it is really refreshing to hear your angle on it, to hear that you still say, I don't really feel like I know very much, or I don't have all the
It's
answers.
true.
It's very refreshing. And I love that.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, it's the reality is this was known through the ages. Plato and Democritus debated, the early Greek philosophers debated about it. And the reason why my work created a sensation was, I think, number one, because I had been a philosophy professor and a logician and a medical, and I knew how to say this in a way that was just to be accurate, without making any conclusions. And the
Mm,
material is fascinating in itself. And what I think was happening, see, is that by the late 60s, early 70s, the cardiopulmonary resuscitation was so widespread that it just created a lot more people who had this experience, because people are always getting close to death, but they usually
mm,
die, right?
mm,
Whereas beginning in the 60s and 70s, then you didn't necessarily have to die when you got like
mm,
that. So just many more people. And so
exactly.
and the fact that I handled it in a non-sensational way, just look, you got to make up your own mind.
Exactly. And that is fabulous. I love it. Now, you've recently written a new book, God is Bigger Than the Bible.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting book. Thank you very much. I've
Oh,
had a
thank
little look
you.
through that, got a lot of
Great.
thinking
Thank you.
going. What I know that our listeners will be wondering, what are your thoughts around belief systems? And do you have one yourself with everything that
Mhm.
you've researched, your personal experiences? Where do we begin the conversation talking about beliefs in this world?
Well, that is a very essential question, because it's the pivot point on a lot of this debate. Because, see, a lot of people look at this as a question of belief or disbelief. But I
Mm,
say that belief or disbelief has nothing to do with it. When people say that, talk about my beliefs, they are not really saying much when you think about, because I think, as a logician and epistemologist, when I think of that sentence, I believe that such and such, and then something follows that, right, which you
mm,
believe. Well, why do people choose that one expression and make it something internal when there are dozens of similar locutions that have that same structure. They start with a first person pronoun, have the verb, and then it follows a proposition, follows to that. I know that such and such. I believe that such and such. I suspect that such and such. I guess that such and such. I assume that such and such. Why is belief stand out to be the one in here? So that doesn't make any sense. People have no idea what they're talking about when they talk about beliefs. And then that's one of the things that holds this back. Whether people believe or disbelieve life after death, there is or is not life after death. It doesn't have anything to do with anybody's beliefs, is what I think. And I think this whole thing of beliefs is just, it's kind of an illusion. People love to dispute about the same kinds of things in those same terms. I don't know why they chose that, but there's no such thing as belief in the sense that that term is bandied about. It's a verbal illusion. You got to think of a whole range of expressions. And what those expressions do is they convey to your hearer what degree of confidence they can place on what follows the that based on your say-so. And if it goes all the way up to I know that, you guarantee it, right? And you also you imply that you have some sort of reason to back it up. I believe is less. I assume is weaker. I guess, I suspect, or weaker still. But these expressions, what they do in reality, quite apart from abstractions we have about them, what they really do is they convey to your hearer what degree of confidence they can place on what follows to that based on your say-so, and they imply some sort of process often. Like if I say that I suspect, but why do we talk about our beliefs rather than our suspicions or our assumptions or our knowledge? See, there's something wrong with that. Just what I think.
Interesting. I'm going to have to think about that a little bit more. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. Well, Dr. Raymond Moody, you've certainly got my mind thinking on a lot of different things. I love how we haven't gone anywhere near what I thought we were going to talk about today. We've talked about completely different things. Like I said, I've just been listening to your stories. You've amazed me with so many facets of your life and things that you've been through. I find it so interesting. So I know that we're going to try and chat again because we've got a lot more conversation that needs to come out. But I want to say a massive thank you to you. Thank you from our listeners. I know that a lot, especially our VIP listeners, are very, very excited by the fact that I'm chatting with you.
It goes directly back to you guys. I just thank you so much for this. I've had such a great time, and all the viewers and listeners, thank you so much for tuning in.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Let's Talk Near Death podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated with all of the events we have going on, and to visit www.letstalkneardeath.com to join the VIP community.